And thank you all for coming. I hope you've digested your turkey and are ready to engage in this really interesting discussion. As John said, I'm going to moderate. When Sally asked me to participate in the seminar talking about the Clean Energy Finance Initiative, I said, sure, I'd be happy to do that, and I'll invite this distinguished panel so we can share the experience together. So I'm really excited to have everyone here. I'm going to just very briefly lay out what the Clean Energy Finance Initiative is. I'm going to introduce our panelists in a little more detail, and then I'm going to set the stage with some facts and data, and we're going to get right into the discussion. So the Clean Energy Finance Initiative, heretofore SEFIE, is what we're going to call it. I don't know if that's what it'll ultimately be called, but for brevity, we'll call it that today. It's a program run out of the Precourt Institute for Energy. It got off the ground with a gift from Bank of America, which is a longtime GSEP sponsor, and I think the bank, while very interested and keen to advance innovation in hard tech, realized that it had a lot of interest in breaking down barriers in clean energy finance and wanted to see what Stanford could do in this space. So that's how things got started. As John mentioned, I wear two hats. I serve as the Deputy Director of the Seiger Center and also now as the Managing Director of SEFIE. So this initiative set out to really do two things: identify barriers, investment barriers hampering the rapid, large-scale deployment of clean energy globally, and to identify a suite of innovative solutions. We talk a lot in this room, I think, about innovation from a technology perspective, but the innovative solutions we're talking about in SEFIE are of a different variety. They're about financial innovation, and financial innovation is about new methods and products that help influence the speed, scale, and direction of capital flows. So in this first phase, what we delivered over a period of about 4 months, it was quick, we put together a framing paper and 8 solutions papers, which were all presented and workshopped at a forum on November 1st. That was an invitation-only event with a keynote from Secretary Kerry. Secretary Schultz participated. We had a great group of speakers. You can look at the website for the full list. The framing paper set out to build a scaffolding that outlined risks and opportunities on which to frame these 8 solutions, which put together blueprints for innovative financial mechanisms and policies that could unlock capital at the speed and scale required. We cast a wide net from across campus. We recruited scholars from business, law, and policy, engineering as well. And the framing paper was a collaboration between the Seiger Center and the Hoover Institute. And we did that in order to yield the most pragmatic and balanced approach to the barriers we identified and the solutions we started to sketch. We're going to hear more about that paper in a minute. Dan's going to talk about that. And then the solutions papers covered a very wide range of topics, geographies from the U.S. power sector regulation to issues in China and India. They span technologies from geothermal and advanced nuclear to off-grid solar, and they span stages from early innovation to large-scale deployment. And they had a temporal scope from the short, medium, and long term, and from here to 2050. I encourage you all, if you haven't yet already, to Google the Clean Energy Finance Initiative and to find all these research papers which are housed on a website. Briefly going to introduce our panelists. Dan Reicher, immediately to my left, is the Executive Director of the Seiger Center. He's a former Assistant Secretary of Energy at the Department of Energy and the Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, EERE. He was a co-principal author of the framing paper I mentioned called De-risking Decarbonization, Making Green Energy Investments Blue Chip. Jeff Ball, in the middle, is our scholar in residence at the Seiger Center, also our resident China expert. He's the former energy editor at the Wall Street Journal and wrote the solutions paper, Loosening the Logjam, Enabling More Efficient Clean Energy Finance in China. I was going to say, don't get too close or he'll hyphenate you. And when you see the title of that paper, you'll get that joke. And then at the far left, we have So-Young In, who's a doctoral candidate in civil and environmental engineering. Her research focuses on catalyzing private capital into clean energy innovation. In addition to the solution paper she co-authored for this initiative on designing an integrated control tower to unlock long-term investment capital for clean energy innovation, She's doing groundbreaking research on market performance of decarbonizing investment. And just a few weeks ago, won the Clean Energy Education Environment C3E Poster Award. So congratulations for that. So I'm just going to briefly set the stage here. So what we're talking about today is what SEFIE aims to address, which is the so-called global clean energy finance gap. So there are a lot of measuring sticks out there. The one we used in the framing paper is from the International Energy Agency, which says that in order to achieve its so-called 450 scenario, which is keeping global CO2 within 450 parts per million, which is what is required to maintain 2 degrees, investment in energy efficiency, renewables, transmission and storage, and low-carbon energy generation, i.e. CCS and nuclear, needs to be at $2.3 trillion a year from now to 2040. So now for the next 25 years. That's 3 times the current spend. So some grounding data points to put this in perspective. When we talk about trillions, my mind gets a little mushy. So let me offer you some trillions as some benchmarks. So the global stock of capital is 100 trillion, roughly. The flow of capital, in other words, the amount of money that moves around within that stock on an annual basis, is about 3.4 trillion annually. There's a ray of hope in here, another $1 trillion measuring stick. Bad debt. There's about $9 trillion of government debt that's trading with a negative yield today. Presumably, that capital would like to be elsewhere. Also note, again, on this topic of innovation, VC, venture capital. So when we're talking about funding hard tech energy innovation, that number is a tiny, tiny rounding error on these trillions. And that's why SEFIE is focused primarily on the 99%. So while there's really great work going on, and I've spent a lot of time in this area on trying to move capital towards funding the really hard stuff in energy innovation, this work is really much more focused on funding deployment with existing technologies in hard-to-reach geographies or in politically unpalatable technologies. The good news is the transition to a new mix of energy sources and uses is already evident around the world. Some evidence. The unsubsidized clean energy prices are breaking records around the world. Solar PV bids for a project in Saudi Arabia last month just came in at under 2 cents a kilowatt hour. Onshore wind in Morocco at 3 cents a kilowatt hour, and offshore wind in Germany is down to under 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Incumbents are showing signs of stress. You've seen a raft of coal bankruptcies. U.S. oil and gas companies have stranded $79 billion in Chapter 11 bankruptcies since 2015. And EV adoption is moving into the fast lane. UK and France have announced bans on fossil fuel cars in the next 20 years, and China is announcing plans to do the same. So why do we need to break down barriers when solar is less than 2 cents a kilowatt hour? Because critical technologies and geographies are still starved for capital. For example, we need 6 times more investment in energy efficiency than we currently have, 9 times more investment in other low-carbon fuels, including CCS and nuclear. Then there's the geography problem. Most of the roughly 100 trillion in stock are held in OECD countries, and most of the need is in non-OECD countries. In Brazil, Russia, India, and China, 4 non-OECD countries known as the BRICS, investment needs are bigger than their current investment in assets. My panelists here have studied the barriers constraining capital flows, and each have put forth really innovative ideas for keys to 450. So let's get to it. Dan, let's start with you. Tell us about the different types of investment risks investors face when considering allocating capital to clean energy deployments.
Well, thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Sally. Thank you, John. Very pleased to be here and very pleased to talk about this subject, one that
Someone's calling.
someone
has a question already. We are going to have time for questions.
Not me. Somebody is ringing.
It's in a bag, but go ahead.
So let me try to set the stage a little bit, and then let me get directly to Alicia's question about the kind of risk we face. So we went to New York and sat down with 9 investment banks in July and really probed what was in the way of what they need to do both in the US and internationally. to dramatically scale up clean energy investment. Again, pretty much in project investments. We're not talking early stage venture. And we kind of hypothesized 3 issues, 3 problems, and we got pretty good support for what we concluded in this report. First, something we call the quantity problem. Alicia alluded to it, and that is that we've got to triple clean energy investment from $750 billion to $2.25 trillion, and we got to do it very quickly if we're going to stay within 2 degrees C, 450 parts per million. That's the quantity problem. The quality problem is that most of the big institutional investors, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies, where most of this large stock of capital, the 100 trillion resides, they have a pretty conservative approach to investing that doesn't line up very well with the risks that we face in most clean energy projects around the world. So that's the quality problem. They're not being presented with deals, with opportunities for investment that meet their risk profile. And the third is the location problem, which is much of the money, most of this institutional capital is in the developed world, much of the need is in the developing world. So those are 3 big problems that kind of framed this whole approach that we're beginning to take. And more than anything else, addressing these 3 big problems means we've got to deal with the actual hardcore investment risks that we face in energy project investing around the world. What do I mean by that? Volatile electricity markets where prices in some cases can actually go negative in some cases. Natural gas prices that have gone up and down by 4x in recent years. Changing clean energy mandates. Sometimes they're here, sometimes they're gone. And volatile carbon prices in many jurisdictions. On again and off again government subsidies. Think about the tax credits in the US. Unproven, albeit innovative, but still unproven technologies. One that a lot of developers face, complex, time-consuming, unpredictable permitting. Rule of law issues in much of the developing world. For example, tough to enforce a contract in many countries, or they don't have a bankruptcy code on the books. And volatile currencies in many parts of the developing world, and often inadequate carbon disclosures. So our framing paper digs into each of these kinds of risks, briefly presents some ideas about solutions, and then lays out some examples of further research. There is one big exception that I want to point out that some of you may be thinking about right now, which is utility scale solar and wind seem to be taking off in the developed world. And that is in fact the case. They use well-established technologies, wind turbines, solar panels. They can lock in predictable subsidies in many cases. They often have a firm fixed price construction contract, so they actually know what the project is going to cost. They often have a long-term power purchase agreement with someone to buy it. And all of that gets you a long-term competitively priced loan, exactly what you need to develop a project. But take a project like that to the developing world and things become much more problematic with fluctuating currencies, the difference between the rupee and the dollar. A power purchaser that doesn't pay on time or sometimes doesn't pay at all. A government that reneges on the subsidies that it announces. And then an innovative technology that replaces the well-established one where you can't get a firm fixed price contract. You got to let it float. And even in the US, with those wind and solar projects I just mentioned, things are getting actually harder rather than easier. What do I mean by that? The best grid interconnection points in many cases have been used up. New transmission lines are often tough to site. And now, literally as we speak, the solar and wind energy tax credits are at risk in the Senate and House tax bills, sending a huge, huge shudder through the clean energy investment industry in the United States. And then, finally, instead of a nice solar or wind project with a nice established technology, you know, a GE or Vestas turbine, and you pick your favorite solar panel, let's make it carbon capture or cogeneration or nuclear, or even energy efficiency, and all of a sudden, you face a lot more risks on the technology side. So That's what we face right now, both in the developing world and in the developed world. The good news, and then I'll wrap up, is that I think there are lots of different ways, lots of different approaches to address these kinds of risks. There are good models, and there are more that can be developed.
Great, thank you. We're going to get to those ideas, and I heard some rumblings when you mentioned the tax credit, so I'm sure we're going to get some questions on that. But I want to go to Jeff next.
They shouldn't be rumblings, they should be groans.
I heard those too. So, Jeff, let's talk about China. I mean, China's always been the elephant in the room on climate, and now that the U.S. has left the room, it is even more so. So, what does this audience need to know about scaling clean energy deployment in China?
Well, so let me be cute at the outset. Let me first of all challenge the notion that the U.S. has left the room. We can have a discussion about that, about the extent, what the U.S. means in this context and what leaving the room means. But let me just be cute on one point. I mean, China's the elephant in the room, and maybe China's the panda in the room. And you smile, but this is actually a really important question. I mean, is China brown or is China green? And you can pick your statistics that support either view. And I think what you want to walk out of here with is the notion that it's way too complicated to come down on either side. I mean, China is doing more of everything than anyone. So I promised Alicia, and I will try to adhere to the promise, that we're going to stick to like 3 minutes here. So I want to whip through a couple things, and I want to be quiet, and hopefully this is fodder for discussion. Let me kind of give you one proposition and 4 points under that proposition. So here's the proposition. Whether the world wins or loses the climate game is going to be largely about China in particular and about the developing world more broadly. I don't think it's really possible to challenge that notion. And proposition sort of point B is that there is an awful lot of money sloshing around China, but that money is, number one, inadequate to China's aspirations, and number two, being spent really badly at the admission of people at very senior levels in China, in industry and government. If they were sitting here, they wouldn't controvert that notion. And so there is a real effort going on in China to spend that money much more efficiently on the theory that if you're going to spend more money, you better be spending it well. So I want you to walk away from here with the notion that this is not just about increasing the size of the pie. This is also about, I don't know where the metaphor goes, but this is also about spending the money that's being spent better. Okay, 4 really quick points. China's at a crucial turning point in a number of ways. In its economy, as many of you know, there are increasing expectations that China's CO2 emissions will peak in the next several years. There's a debate about precisely when. China is at a crucial turning point in the aggressiveness of its low carbon policies. Alicia mentioned electric vehicles. Pick your favorite technology, carbon capture, solar, wind. Very, very aggressive policies in China. Jury's out as to whether those will be enforced. We can have that conversation. China's at a real turning point in terms of its resolve to restructure the financial mechanisms and the policies that it's using to deploy clean energy capital, that is to make this whole enterprise much more efficient. No one in a position of power in China needs telling that China has been inefficient and needs to fix that. And it's not just a matter of talking privately to people. You can go and read public documents that admit that. 2 more points. China's at a turning point in terms of its capacity for technological innovation. Really, really important with an audience at Stanford. It's really surprising to me how many people, particularly in Silicon Valley, delude themselves with the notion that China is not innovating. China's innovating. And again, we can have a discussion about the extent to which that's happening, but that absolutely changes a lot about how the world develops these technologies. And lastly, China is at a turning point in terms of its involvement in global finance. That is, China is spending money not just in China, but around the world, in the places whose energy trajectories are going to have a huge effect in their growth, Africa, Latin America, and also within 15 miles of the room we're sitting in Silicon Valley. China is remaking Silicon Valley, a point that we may talk about a little bit more. Okay, 3 more points and I'll do them really quickly. There are huge challenges in China, huge challenges in terms of an inefficient state bureaucracy, huge challenges in terms of the fact that there seems to be a lot of capital and that fact masking the desire for reform. And Alicia mentioned the United States, challenges in terms of the relationship between China and the United States, very vitriolic right now, and China's relationship with other countries. Lastly, and then I'll shut up, a couple of opportunities. There is a real opportunity for the United States, for investors in the United States. And the game is not just about cleaning up the skies in China. The game is not just about cooling the planet. The game is also about something that matters to a lot more people than either of those things does, perhaps present company excluded. And that is helping the United States economy, if the US plays this right. And the last thing I would say is, and maybe we'll get into this, there are really, really interesting aspirations that China has enunciated very, very recently for a very sophisticated reset of its financial system to push a lot of the technology that Dan's talked about, to use a lot of the mechanisms that Alicia has flecked at here and has spent a lot of time working at. And it's really interesting to just sort of examine this as a window into the degree of sophistication of thinking in China. Again, unclear whether these are more than nice sounding words, but really different from what you heard 2 or 3 years ago. I'm done.
Thank you. That was great. There's a lot to unpack in there. I want to draw So Young into the conversation, and then we'll go around the horn again. I mentioned in my introduction that while we spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley and Stanford focused on energy innovation, this broader initiative has been focused more so on deployment. Your paper was an exception to that. You designed an integrated control tower. We've been talking about lots of different geographies flying around the world. Can you walk us through that control tower and tell us what its core functions are?
Sure. Well, let me introduce my background first. So before joining my PhD program at Stanford, I was in banking industry, actually the state-owned bank, for about 7 years. And I was one in the first line dealing with the heavy inertia within our organization and internal and external stakeholders and the business partners to deploy our capitals into this clean energy investment. And from this experience, I feel there is a strong need for the reliable information for the investors to quickly think about how to perceive and consider the environmental factors in their decision-making process, and also a market-based the investment vehicle through which various type of investors can actually mobilize their capital to clean energy projects and companies. So my current research is focusing on how to design and implement this actual investment vehicle, especially for the early stage clean energy technology. And when the technology is turning into a business that goes through R&D and proof of concept and piloting and first commercialization and commercialization scale. And all this we call the development life cycle. And if you see this entire development life cycle, there are a huge communication gap, not only between the entrepreneurs and the investors, but also among the investors. So why is that? Is first of all, I would say the pre and post commercialization investors, their business models are not well aligned. And therefore, their information, like important information about the companies, such as technology status, their market and management readiness, or like how long and how much capital they would need until they hit the exit. Those kind of informations are often manipulated because of this misalignment of this investor network. And you may heard about the valley of death. And this opacity and the complexity and the lack of investment opportunity kind of widens up this valley. And the key point here is the negative loop created from this early investors' experience kind of shrink further the opportunity set, and the interested investors, such as pension fund endowments, like we call long-term institutional investors, so they cannot come into the early stage clean energy investment. But yes, there are innovative investment initiatives that try to tackle those problems, like prime and aligned intermediary or cyclotron road. But what they are doing is only tackling the subset of the entire life cycle problem. So what we instead suggest is the integrated control tower that kind of integrates all the effort that is like independently exists in the current market, so that like it works like a control tower that tells various type of investors in different phases like where to go and like how to deploy their capitals in cost-effective ways so that they can maximize their return more precisely, risk-adjusted return. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. I'm trying to decide how far I can take the control tower metaphor, and I'm gonna and whether you can mix it with low-hanging fruit. I'm gonna leave it alone and come back to Dan. And the elephant in the room and the panda. I really like the panda.
Jeff,
Yeah.
what color's a panda? What color's an elephant? I was trying to get the...
That's great. That's great. So Dan, you laid out a strong case for all the different types of risks. I want to leave the audience with a little hope here. And so this next round, and get ready because soon I'm going to be looking to you for questions. Rays of hope, and we're going to do this in a rapid fire because we want to leave time for audience questions. So what's your favorite piece of low-hanging fruit on the opportunity side?
I think there's lots that can be done to improve permitting, for example. I mean, that's an area the Obama administration took several steps. David Hayes, a colleague at the law school, was in the Obama administration at Interior. They made some great improvements in how you get big projects permitted. Instead of having each one be its own battle, starting from scratch with its own environmental impact statement and its own set of permits, there's a whole other approach to large land areas and focusing down from there. So that's one area. The other thing is I do think these currency issues, these difference in currency value between, say India and the United States, I think there are some mechanisms that can address that. And that looms very large in terms of the interest in U.S. investors in the developing world.
Jeff, you had a lot, you laid out a lot of challenges and pathways to opportunities in China. What are you most interested in exploring in the next phase?
Yeah, I think it is the extent to which private capital is way ahead of politics on this. Just as a very quick point, there are so many compelling reasons for private capital in the United States and in China to integrate in a way that makes money for both of them, and that in the end probably is the world's best hope for addressing some of these environmental challenges. That if the political impediments to that integration of private capital can be removed, or at least the big ones can be removed to a greater extent than they've been removed, then I think you just watch the money flow. I mean, that's a little simplistic, but I think that it's easy to get preoccupied with very nasty headlines these days. And I think that if you're preoccupied with those headlines, you're missing the bigger story, which is the self-interested movement of capital between China and the United States, and frankly among lots of countries. And those numbers are ramping up, although clearly, as Alicia and Dan have pointed out, not nearly as much as they need to ramp up, which is why some of these mechanisms that everyone's talking about here are really important.
Thank you. Okay, audience, I'm coming to you next. I'm going to ask So-Young one more question, and this is actually outside the scope of your paper, but I think it's relevant here, which is to say other ways to unlock capital, which is by identifying unpriced risks in the current investment landscape, which is your work on sort of decarbonization in equities. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how that might play into this equation?
Sure. So as an investor and then also becoming the academia, and I think like we as academia or environmentalists, whoever try to push this clean energy innovation, we need to speak about the language of the investors if we really need their money to this innovation really take on. And I was thinking like, it might be helpful if I can demonstrate the desired the risk-adjusted return at their language. Then it would be really helpful for them to, like motivate to change their current investment practice. So in this paper, I was exactly using what the Wall Street portfolio managers and asset managers are using for analyzing and evaluating the investment portfolio. And I try to show whether there can be environmental factors can generate not only just return, but risk-adjusted return. I would say pure alpha. So, and then luckily I was able to show like within last 5 years, like starting from 2010 to 2015, there were actually the pure alpha. It looks like, although it's a short-term period still, but it's coming to this, the investment strategy by changing their investment destination to the carbon inefficient firms to carbon efficient firm. And that one was very interesting because it's great message to the investors who are considering to change their investments practice, but try to persuade their stakeholders. Hey, so this is a subtle evidence we find, and this is a reason that we have to change our first move. So I think that one is a contribution of my paper. Yeah.
Do you have a sense for how much capital could move on that data?
Yeah, so it's a little technical, but I construct what is called EMI portfolio, so efficient minus inefficient portfolios. So simply, it's like an investment strategy. You you short your carbon efficient stocks and long your carbon efficient stocks, and try to see how those portfolio would perform over the 10 years of sample period. So, and I've been tried like several ways to construct this EMI portfolio in different factors, but my basic benchmark shows the 3.5 to 5.4% per year on annualized return, which is really huge. Like it's enough to the investors to reconsider their investment practices. Yeah.
That's great. I just realized I was managing us to an earlier start time for Q&A, but I did offer that I was coming to you next, so I will keep to my promise. Do folks have questions they want to get started with now? Sir.
It's good to see some people from Seiger, because every time I've gone over there in the law school, nobody's been in the office. So, yeah, I've had a number of people with PhDs, Stanford and so forth, write letters and get no response. So, I'm interested in talking with you later about what's going on. I think that it's really important to get back to basics. We're talking about electric power generation, correct? Funding that around the world. Electricity is a very unusual thing in the sense that it's a fungible resource. If I have a generator in my garage, she has one, and we turn them on, and our neighbors in this room are taking electricity from the wiring. No one can tell whose electrical energy is coming from my generator or hers. It's very different from water supply, sewer, fire, police, all the other services we call utilities. So I encourage everyone to look up the word fungible if you haven't heard it. And what that offers up is the chance for all sorts of people to come in with all sorts of gimmicks of how to make money off a fungible resource. Because you can hide the source. California hides how much coal we burn to run LA, for instance. We hide. How many?
That's what the question is.
Well, I'm getting to the question. So the question is, if you're going to invest a lot of capital in something, isn't it really prudent to invest in something that's actually functional and useful long term, rather than saying, well, solar is almost zero cost now? No, it's not. The hurricanes destroyed solar in the Caribbean.
Okay, so
Double the cost, right?
so the
What do you mean?
So I think there's a question here of the sort of quality of the investments, which is an important question. Dan, you want to weigh in on that?
Well, so it's interesting. If you look at what we looked at, which is the International Energy Agency's projections of what's going to be needed in the 450 parts per million 2 degrees C, the biggest jump by far and the biggest absolute number by far is the jump in energy efficiency investments. That's where they say we've got to start. And I think we need to jump from 200 billion a year right now to 1.2 or 1.3 trillion. And so I guess I could very easily answer the question, the place to start is with energy efficiency. That clearly is our low-hanging fruit, and it's one that has its own set of risks in terms of investment. So I would start there. And then I think, each of these energy technologies has its challenges in the finance world. They do have to be They do have to become more transparent. But I think that's the beauty of the investment world, because those hard questions get asked by investors before they put dollars into the project. The debt providers, the equity providers, those are the hard questions. So I'm pretty confident that the investment community gets up every day and is asking the right questions. Our job right now is actually to cut those investment risks so that more of that money starts to flow into the clean stuff.
Yeah, and Jeff, do you want to comment at all? You mentioned before the inefficiency of capital spend in China. Do you want to weigh in on this from the Chinese perspective?
Just a couple things. I think the question really is all this stuff just sort of hooey? I mean, this is all just kind of subsidized sop. And let's have a real energy source is kind of the question. So let's just be clear on a couple of points. This is not an either or. I mean, if this is an either or, and if this stuff that we're talking about up here is just hooey, then a lot of really smart capitalists are really wrong. So there is a lot of money going into this stuff, and I think a more interesting question than whether that money should be going into this stuff is how ought that money to go into this stuff in a way that actually produces results. And so, yeah, I mean, Alicia, there have been real inefficiencies in capital allocation in this stuff in China, just like in Europe, just like in the United States. So I'll give you a Chinese example, and I'll give you well, see how much time we got. So here's a Chinese example. There was a subsidy for solar energy initially that was based, and I'll try to vastly oversimplify here, but the subsidy was based on the amount of money that someone spent investing in a solar project, not based on the amount of electricity that that solar project produced. So that's a pretty distinct signal, and there are smart investors, and what do? You invest in a lot of metal. It doesn't matter how efficient the metal is, the METAL is, you just invest in putting stuff in the ground. So people invested in putting stuff in the ground, and there were stories that literally people put stuff in the ground, pocketed a subsidy, unscrewed the stuff from the ground, moved it somewhere else, bolted it into the ground again, and pocketed another subsidy. So that's pretty inefficient, particularly on the scale that's happening in China. But before we get too sort of kind of happy with ourselves sitting in the United States, I mean, there are inefficiencies in the way that the United States subsidizes this stuff, which is to say inefficiencies in the sense that we subsidize based on tax breaks, which means that in order to pocket these tax breaks, you have to have a tax liability big enough. That means, again, to truncate vastly, that you bring in financial institutions that have a tax liability. Those institutions exact a price for their participation in these deals, and although estimates vary, some significant portion of the amount of money that American taxpayers are pouring into these subsidies is going into the pockets of Wall Street financial institutions, as opposed to putting stuff on the ground. Now, maybe that's necessary, but that is a reality of the system. And so, again, on and on and on, there are massive examples in Europe as well. But again, this is not news really to anyone who's in the system, and I don't suggest these things to be taken to mean that it's all kind of a crazy escapade. The reality is it needs to be made much more efficient, because the money is going to go into this stuff, and at the end of the day, the money should go into some of this stuff. The money also should go into other things as it is.
Another question. I want to hear from a student. I'm going to guess you're a student.
How do you mitigate against foreign currency fluctuation risks? That's interesting to me primarily because I'm from the developing world, and the past year the currency fluctuation's been at about 10-12%. So that really affects your bottom line when the first waterfall round goes into the debt part, into the debt finance.
I'll point you to a paper that is one of the solutions papers on this whole question of volatility in currency for India. And it looked at a couple of different ways that one could hedge. There are issues with each of them, but it's pretty clear that some combination of things can at least cut some of that volatility. The other challenge, which kind of combines with the currency issue in India, that's also highlighted in this paper, are some of the offtake risks. The state electricity companies in India that are often not fully capitalized and can't guarantee payments that they're subject to. So those two things have hit hard in India, but we walked through some mechanisms that I think could be helpful. But I'd have to say it's probably at the top of the list in terms of the reluctance of foreign investors in putting money into some of these developing countries. And there is no simple solution, but I think there's a variety of mechanisms, both public and private, that can help.
I'll just add to that is the opportunity for philanthropic capital to play a role in mitigating some of that risk. So there's some sort of non-market in a traditional sense actors that can come in and take some of that risk off the table. Did you want to weigh in? Yeah.
Yes, I'm just adding to that. So in the banking world, I was a project finance manager, and so like I was dealing with this interest rate fluctuation risk and the political risk, and sometimes it's kind of like mixed together, and it just
Are you student? No, student. Okay.
This question it derives from statements by two people I'm sure you're very familiar with. Amory Lovins, founder of the Colorado Rocky Mountain Institute, once said, "There is no answer to clean tech and carbon neutrality that is a single silver bullet, but there are a lot of silver BBs." And then Stephen Chu at the MIT Energy Forum was asked, "What do you think is the most promising thing coming out down the horizon?" And nobody had ever heard of liquid batteries before. He said, "We need something to stabilize the grid between wind and solar and provide large-scale power." So what I'm asking you to do right now is, based on the silver bullets, silver BBs thing, can you forecast what you think is the most promising thing that looks like it's out there on the horizon, please?
Yeah, I'll put that to the panelists, but also with reference that we're talking about, I'm going to spin that question a little bit to say with regard to financial or policy innovation, because we are not technology.
If it's a financial answer, then so be it.
Yeah, I mean, that is how, to be, in fairness to our panelists, although if any of you have something you're working on in your lab that you haven't told me about, happy to hear that too. Please, so Young, go ahead.
I think so. I mean, technology is definitely one the risk factors, but I think there are more risk factors that you have to think about. And the thing is, technology risk should be just technology risk, but that should be not distracting the investors to come in this innovative development cycle. So what we really have to do is we have to define what are the risks and then try to match the right risk to the right basket. So and also try to find who are more comfortable with taking that specific risk is very important. So I mean, I am not expert in the technology side, but I'm talking more about the organizational optimization side. You know, like the basic assumption that I am talking here is like there should be some investors or the corporates that are more comfortable with like a specific risk. But the thing is not entire the risk as a whole. So if we can categorize the risk and then match the risk to the right people, then you can actually increase the risk-adjusted return. So that's why I kind of emphasize we should think about the risk-adjusted return, not the return itself.
And
Yeah.
One of the functions
One of the function of that integrated tower. Yeah.
Jeff or Dan, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, so Amory Lovins has lots of great quotes. I'll just throw one out here just for grins. One of my favorites is that, which you'll laugh at, but you ought to think about because it actually has some import, is that at the end of the day, in the energy discussion, what people want are hot showers and cold beer. And anything that deprives people of their hot showers and cold beer is not going to fly. So to answer your question, I'll answer your question because I think I'm supposed to be the China guy here. Just two really high-level points. People in this country, I think, tend to talk about China in very sort of 30,000-foot political terms. China is a communist country, an autocracy, and therefore China is all about Beijing yanking levers. So there are definitely certain levers that Beijing can yank and is yanking, or probably not yanking, but more like turning the dials slowly, and that's happening. I guess the other thing I would say is that there are movements of private capital that are really important. And a really important trend to watch is the extent to which China allows private capital to play much more creatively than it has thus far. Not time here to get into that stuff, but if you think about a lot of the energy revolution that has happened in the United States and I think in Europe as well, it's largely a function of smaller actors playing. And China is aware of that, the people who lead China are aware of that, and what's happening right now, if you look a bit below the surface, is an attempt to sort of tenderize the system so that that creativity can happen. And I think that's a really important thing to watch.
Great.
We started with the International Energy Agency numbers for a reason, which is that it takes a very, very broad look technologically, to your point, all the way from efficiency to electricity networks to storage, all of the renewables, not just solar and wind, to nuclear to CCS, transmission. And I think that's ultimately the place where we got to get to if we're really going to get to these carbon reductions. I'd also say that, even within the storage category, as you know, are we looking at seconds or minutes or hours or days or months? That takes you in very different direction when it comes to storage technologies. And if you take it back to policy and finance, the policy measure is, for example, is the government going to put money broadly into all these different R&D areas? Is the policy going to lead you to a smart electricity pricing system that sends the right signals so that many of these technologies can compete and ultimately we can make the kind of carbon reductions broadly, and I'd say including, first and foremost, starting with energy efficiency, which is in fact takes you back to Amory Lovins, and he always says this is where you got to begin.
I have some comments. I'm not talking about financial. Energy security is a must for mankind.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We are all going to be able to stick around afterwards to answer individual questions, but we are at time, and I was going to say, I was debating whether we were going to do one last question. If we're going to do one last question, it's going to be from a student, and otherwise I'm going to wrap up, and I'm sorry. Are there any students who have a question? Yes.
All right. Thank you so much for your talk. My question actually regards to what you were talking about earlier, Dan, with meeting heads of my in terms of what is the sentiment with regards to cryptocurrencies? And while that's a bit of a hype word and there's a bit of buzz on this, and it's a big question that we can end on, but interested to understand as a currency, as this way to de-risk and hedge against risk, and then also on the technology side, blockchain is a technology to incorporate a variety of actors and stakeholders in these investments.
I have a little to say, and I won't do it justice. So Jeff, you give it a try.
Well, all I'll tell you is that blockchain came up in a discussion I had recently with someone who's extraordinarily savvy about the system of finance in China, particularly the system of energy finance in China. And the notion is that really smart people in China are starting to look at blockchain given the devaluation of the RMB. And there's a sense of what does this country do to try to put a floor under the devaluation. And I am no blockchain expert, but I think it's a fascinating development that this is starting to be discussed seriously.
And we should have a panel on this.
Yeah, we should. And I'm going to pick up on that last point to say that there is another phase here of this initiative. We don't yet know exactly what it's going to be, but opportunities like that are great questions to explore. I'll also say, just drawing this back to the last COP in Bonn, where it's sort of, folks I talked to who were there kind of felt like the 90s again, where countries started to split back into Annex 1 and Annex 2, and where's the money going to come from and how it's going to flow. And so these questions beyond this gap that we've identified in absolute terms, but how do we come up with innovative mechanisms to move capital where it needs to go is so critical. And so this work is just beginning, and we would love to involve you in it as we move forward. So
Any of you are students and you're interested in this, just email us, one of us, and because we'd love to
We need help.
involve you.
yeah, this is hard stuff. Please join me in thanking our panelists.